The wind howled through the jagged ravine like a living thing, carrying with it the bitter cold of the alien night. The humans sat by a small, flickering fire, its orange light casting shadows against the blue rock walls of the abandoned mining site. He hadn't expected to be here alone, not this deep into unclaimed space, but convoy assignments didn't care about what anyone expected. His name didn't matter much out here, just the fact that he was human. And in these corners of the galaxy, that word carried weight. He chewed through the last of his ration bar, tasting the stale salt, when he heard it, a soft, trembling sound, almost too quiet for the wind to carry. It wasn't an animal cry. It was something younger, weaker, afraid. His hand reached instinctively for the sidearm at his hip, but he didn't raise it. He knew the sound of fear when he heard it. From the darkness beyond the firelight, two yellow eyes blinked. Small, wide, not hostile. He held his breath as the creature crept forward on trembling legs, its fur soaked from the freezing wind, its ribs visible beneath its dark stripes. An alien cub. He'd seen its species before, once, on a distant outpost where their kind ruled the forests like apex predators. They were rare this far out, and they didn't travel alone. This one was lost. Hungry. Terrified. He could have ignored it. Most people in this galaxy would have. But something in those shaking legs and wide eyes cut through the cold night like a blade. Slowly, carefully, he reached into his pack, broke the last of his rations in half, and set it down on the rock between them. The cub froze. Then it crept forward, inch by inch, nose twitching, fur bristling at every sound. When it reached the food, it didn't snatch it like a wild thing. It hesitated, then looked at him. That single look hit harder than he expected. It was the look of someone who'd been abandoned and didn't know why. When it finally ate, the small crunching sound of teeth against the ration was the only thing in the canyon besides the wind. He sat perfectly still, watching, not knowing that in that quiet moment, he had just made a promise that would change everything. The cub curled near the edge of the fire after it finished eating, still trembling but not running away. He could feel the night pressing against the thin bubble of warmth around them. Somewhere in the darkness, something else was moving. He could feel it, not with his eyes, but in his bones. The way the wind shifted, the way the rocks seemed to hold their breath. Predators had a presence. And whatever had lost this cub wasn't small. His hand moved closer to the sidearm without thinking. Hours passed. He stayed awake, not because he wanted to, but because instinct told him to. He could feel eyes on him, somewhere out there in the dark. Then it happened. The silence broke. A deep growl rolled through the ravine like thunder, low and resonant, the kind that vibrated in the chest more than it reached the ears. The cub jerked upright, its ears twitching, tail flicking anxiously. It knew that sound. So did he. The mother had come. She stepped out of the darkness like a shadow made of muscle and stripes, her fur shining in the faint light, her golden eyes locked on the fire, on him. She was easily 3 times his size, a creature built for hunting apex predators, not sharing space with them. Her lips peeled back slightly, not in rage, but in the kind of warning that said you're still alive because I haven't decided otherwise yet. He didn't move. If he reached for the gun, he'd be dead before he cleared the holster. The cub whimpered softly and stumbled toward her. Her massive head dipped, brushing its small frame gently before turning those eyes back to him. He expected the attack then and there. But instead, she stopped at the edge of the fire's light. Her muscles were still tense, but there was something else in her stare. Recognition. Not of him, but of what he'd done. The cub smelled of human rations. He didn't lower his eyes. Predators respected strength, not weakness. He held her gaze, steady and unflinching, and in that suspended breath between them, the galaxy narrowed to one fire, one human, one mother. She circled slowly, the way hunters test their prey, her massive claws leaving grooves in the dirt. He followed her every step, refusing to back down, but never threatening her. It was a delicate balance, a game played on the knife's edge between life and death. When she finally sat on her haunches, just outside the fire's reach, his heartbeat still hadn't slowed. The cub pressed against her side, safe again, but it kept glancing back at him as if caught between two worlds. The night turned into an uneasy truce. He fed the fire, she watched him, and the cub drifted to sleep between them. Somewhere in that silence, the sound of engines echoed faintly across the rocks. Patrols. Not hers. Dominion raiders. He knew their sound too well. Loud, careless, hunting for anything they could take. The Tigress's ears flicked up, head turning sharply toward the sound. She didn't understand who they were, but she knew danger. He had two choices: stay and let the raiders stumble upon her and the cub, or run and leave them to whatever came next. Humanity was known for a lot of things. Running wasn't one of them. He packed up the fire fast and quiet, sliding behind a slab of rock, watching the lights in the distance. Raiders didn't care what they killed. Alien, human, predator, cub. It didn't matter. The tigress growled, low and furious, instinctively shielding her cub. She didn't trust him. She shouldn't have. But when he pointed toward the ridge, signaling the danger, her eyes flickered, not with understanding, but with the ancient predator's instinct to sense truth. The raiders landed with all the subtlety of wolves kicking in a door. Rough figures climbed down from their battered ship, weapons slung carelessly. They didn't even see him at first. They saw her. The tigress. A trophy to be taken. One of them laughed, too loud for the quiet night, and raised his rifle. The shot never came. The human moved first. He hit the raider like a hammer from the dark, tackling him to the ground before the others could react. Two more turned their rifles on him, but the tigress was faster. She launched out of the shadows with a sound that split the night in two, a roar that made the rocks vibrate. One raider's scream ended before it ever began. The second tried to run. He didn't make it far. The fight was short, brutal, and nothing like the clean battles the council liked to broadcast. It was blood and dirt and teeth and fists. When it was over, the raiders were sprawled in the dust, and the tigress stood over them like a storm given shape. She turned toward him, her breath steaming in the cold. He was breathing hard, blood streaking his face, but he didn't look away. Predator to predator. Something changed in that moment. She didn't growl. She didn't attack. She lowered her head, just slightly. Not submission. Not thanks. Something more ancient. Recognition of a warrior who had stood beside her cub. Then she turned, nudged the small bundle of fur toward him, and walked slowly toward the distant forest. She didn't leave them to die. She waited. The cub padded forward and pressed its small head against his boot. When dawn came, the raider's ship was burning, the sky was clean, and the tigress was gone. But she wasn't really gone. He could still feel her eyes in the tree line, watching, weighing, remembering. And in that cold morning light, a strange bond had been forged, not between a man and a beast, but between two predators who understood the same language. Word of what happened spread like fire in the outer colonies. Raiders avoided the ravine. Workers whispered about the human who walked beside a tigress. And somewhere in the endless forests of that forgotten world, a predator raised her cub with the memory of a man who shared his fire and his food. Thank you for listening to this HFY sci-fi story. If it gave you chills, if it made you feel that spark of what humanity stands for, like, share, and let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more powerful HFY stories where humanity doesn't just survive. It stands shoulder to shoulder with legends. The wind carried the scent of blood and smoke long after the raiders were gone, wrapping itself around the jagged rocks like an invisible predator. The human sat with his back against the scorched hull of the raiders' ship, breath heavy, knuckles raw, the cold night pressing in around him. He didn't speak. He didn't move. But his mind replayed every second of the fight in ruthless detail. The first impact, the scream that never finished, the way the tigress had moved like a blade through darkness. He had seen combat before, in places far uglier than this frozen ravine, but this was different. She wasn't human. She wasn't an ally. She was something older, something the galaxy had forgotten how to respect. Across from him, the cub curled against its mother's side, still trembling, unaware of how close the night had come to ending. The tigress sat upright, golden eyes fixed on him, every muscle coiled but still. She could have left already. She could have killed him and disappeared into the trees. But she stayed. That meant something. Above them, the stars stretched in cold silence, broken only by the faint hum of Dominion patrol beacons moving somewhere high in orbit. The world they stood on was supposed to be empty, just another strip of forgotten rock on the edge of Council space. But out here, where the stars didn't care and the Council didn't look, the rules were different. Bonds weren't made through words. They were carved through survival. He stood slowly, every motion deliberate, not wanting to trigger her instinct to strike. She tracked him with that golden gaze, tail flicking once through the dirt. He kicked one of the raiders' rifles toward the fire pit and began stripping down what was left of their gear. Ration packs. A water filter. Some thermal cloth. The kind of scraps raiders stole from the desperate. He didn't speak to her. He didn't need to. She watched everything he did with the unblinking attention of a hunter deciding whether to kill or follow. When he tossed the last piece of meat onto the fire, he noticed her ears twitch. Not at the smell of food. At something distant. She rose slowly, massive shoulders rolling like quiet thunder. The cub stirred, confused. He didn't need words to understand what was happening. Something else was coming. He lifted the old comm receiver from one of the raiders' belts, flicking through static and broken frequencies. One transmission cut through clearly. Council Scout Detachment inbound. Scan signature confirmed. Non-compliant presence detected. His stomach tightened. The raiders were only the beginning. The Tigress's fur bristled. She didn't understand the words, but she felt the same pressure he did. The kind that falls over a place when bigger predators are on their way. Her species ruled this planet's forests, but she had never dealt with humans or Dominion soldiers. She didn't know how their war machines worked. But he did. And that meant, like it or not, they were in this together. He moved to the raiders' fallen ship, sliding open a cracked panel to expose the power core. The Tigress growled softly, warning him not to approach too close to her cub, but he ignored the sound like he would ignore the hiss of a tired cat. Fear didn't help anyone out here. He ripped out the transponder unit, sparks raining down like fireflies. "They'll be here by sunrise," he muttered under his breath. She didn't know the words, but she understood the way his jaw tightened. He turned to her, pointing toward the mountains in the distance, a dark spine of jagged peaks shrouded in fog. "We have to move." She didn't like that. Her ears flattened slightly, her body shifting protectively over the cub. He held his ground. In another life, in another world, a human and a predator would have torn each other apart right here. But tonight was different. Tonight, they were both prey to something bigger. He crouched low, lowered his weapon, and extended an open hand. Not submission. Not dominance. An offer. The cub tilted its head curiously, its tiny claws clutching the ground. The tigress stared at his hand, her nostrils flaring as she tasted the air between them. Finally, she huffed, a deep, rumbling sound, and turned her head toward the mountains. Not trust, but agreement. The climb began in darkness. The old mining valley stretched for miles, every rusted structure casting long shadows under the pale light of distant moons. He moved with quiet, practiced steps, always a few paces ahead, scanning the horizon for the glimmer of patrol lights. Behind him, the tigress moved like liquid shadow, massive but silent, the cub stumbling to keep up. Every now and then, she would nudge it forward with her head, the quiet rumble in her chest echoing through the night. Halfway up the ridge, the hum of engines returned, louder this time. Dropships. The Council didn't send patrols for strays. They sent hunters. They were sweeping the valley, searching for the raiders they'd tracked, unaware that the raiders were already dead. He flattened himself against the rocks, signaling her to stay low with one hand. To his surprise, she mirrored the motion instinctively, her striped body melting into the terrain like she'd been doing this all her life. The cub, confused but obedient, tucked itself beneath her. For the first time, he realized just how dangerous she truly was. Not just a beast, but a hunter that could outthink most soldiers. The dropships swept overhead, beams cutting through the mist. One stopped, engines whining, scanning the ground. His breath slowed. If they spotted them here, it would be over before it began. He reached for the small transponder core he'd taken earlier, twisted the wires, and hurled it into the opposite ravine. A burst of static filled the comm lines, and the dropship spun toward the sound. It worked. They moved on. The climb continued in silence. By the time the first edge of light touched the ridge, they had reached the mouth of an old mining shaft carved into the mountain centuries ago. It was abandoned now, forgotten by the council, perfect for hiding. He ducked inside first, scanning for movement, then stepped aside to let her pass. She hesitated for only a second before leading the cub into the darkness. Inside, the air smelled of rust and old dust. He set down the stolen thermal cloth and started a small, contained flame. She lay down opposite him, the cub pressing against her side, both sets of golden eyes fixed on the human who had fought beside them instead of against them. The world outside was still dangerous. The council was still coming. But for the first time, they shared the same fire, not as prey and predator, but as two survivors caught in a storm neither had chosen. He leaned back against the cold stone, closing his eyes for a moment, letting the exhaustion wash over him. He didn't know what the next day would bring. But he knew this much: if the council came, they wouldn't be ready for what was waiting in these mountains. Not just a man. Not just a tigress. But a bond they hadn't planned for. A bond forged in the dark between a soldier and a hunter, between fire and shadow. And as the wind howled outside the shaft, carrying the distant hum of war machines, the tigress shifted slightly closer to the fire, her eyes never leaving him. It wasn't trust yet, but it was something close enough to shake the stars. The climb into the mountains wasn't just a way to escape, it was a silent war against the clock. Every step he took echoed with the sound of distant engines. Every gust of wind carried the taste of iron and ash. The human moved through the cold mist like someone who had spent too many nights hiding from the galaxy's cruelty. The tigress followed behind him, her muscles coiling and uncoiling in smooth, controlled movements, the cub padding beside her with the innocent clumsiness of something that didn't yet understand how close death was. Her golden eyes never left him, her ears twitching at every sound he made. She didn't trust him, not fully, but she hadn't killed him either. And out here, between predators, that counted for something. The mist thickened as they reached the high ridge, where the old mining roads had long been swallowed by snow and rock. He knelt, brushing away frost to reveal the faint shimmer of metal beneath. A buried beacon marker from a time when the council actually cared about these outer worlds. He remembered the old maps. He knew these mountains had tunnels running deep into the rock, carved decades ago when humans still mined the stars for survival instead of running from empires. Those tunnels could hide them for a while, maybe long enough to throw the Dominion scouts off their trail. Behind him, the cub tripped over a jagged stone and yelped. In an instant, the tigress was between them, a blur of striped muscle, teeth bared. He froze, hands raised slowly. Her growl vibrated in the air like a low engine. For one long moment, he stared into those predators' eyes, feeling that invisible line between life and death tighten. Then the cub pushed its tiny head against her leg, whining softly. Her tail twitched. She stepped aside, not out of trust, but acknowledgement. A fragile truce. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding and kept walking. The path grew narrower, snaking between tall stone walls that trapped the sound of their breathing. The Dominion dropships were moving closer now. He could hear the distant pulse of engines bouncing off the cliffs. These weren't simple raiders this time. This was a professional sweep. They were tracking heat signatures, movement patterns, anything that didn't belong. He moved faster, waving the tigress toward a narrow cut between two slabs of rock. She hesitated for only a second before nudging the cub through first and following with fluid grace. They reached the mouth of an abandoned mine shaft just as the first searchlights cut across the ridge. He ducked inside, pressing his back against the cold stone, pulse steady despite the adrenaline flooding his veins. Outside, the beams swept over the snow, tracing lazy, predatory circles. The tigress flattened herself against the shadows opposite him, every muscle tensed but silent. She was a creature made for moments like this, born to disappear in the wild. Let others walk past without ever realizing she was there. For the first time, he wasn't just impressed. He was grateful. The Dominion soldiers landed nearby, their boots crunching against the frozen ground. Their voices carried through the fog, harsh, metallic, stripped of warmth. Tracker shows movement. Not raiders. Could be wildlife. Kill it if it moves. He clenched his jaw. Wildlife was exactly what they'd think she was. They'd shoot first, dissect later. He couldn't let that happen. Not to the cub, not to her. He reached into his pack and pulled out the cracked transponder he'd salvaged earlier. With quick, practiced fingers, he rewired the beacon into a makeshift decoy, hot-wiring its battery to create a false heat signature. Then he tossed it down the opposite ridge. The bait worked. A moment later, a burst of energy split the night as the soldiers opened fire on empty snow. He didn't wait. He motioned toward the tunnel, his movements short and sharp. The Tigress tilted her head slightly but followed, leading the cub deeper into the dark. The shaft was narrow, jagged, barely holding its shape after years of neglect. He dragged a rusted door into place behind them, masking their heat signature. The sound of boots echoed faintly outside, growing fainter by the second. Deeper inside, the tunnel widened into an old storage bay littered with broken crates, frost-covered machinery, and the lingering smell of iron. The cub stumbled toward one of the rusted walls and curled up instinctively. The Tigress paced slowly, ears flicking, tail twitching. She didn't like being underground. He didn't either. But this was survival. He set down his gear, checked his ammo, 2 mags left, and sat against the wall, letting the cold seep through him. She stopped pacing after a while, lowering herself to the ground opposite him. Her golden eyes glowed faintly in the dim light, watching him without blinking. He'd fought wars against aliens, for aliens, alongside them, but never like this. There was no translator between them, no flag, no orders. Just a strange, silent understanding between two beings who didn't trust the world around them. The cub raised its small head, glanced between them, then shuffled forward until it was halfway between the Tigress and the human, curling back into a ball with its tail wrapped around its body. He leaned his head back, letting the stillness settle. Outside, the Dominion would keep searching. They always did. But something told him this was more than just another patrol. The Council had ways of dealing with loose ends. They'd want the Tigress for a trophy. They'd want him silenced. But they didn't know what they were really walking into. Because humans didn't survive the galaxy by being the strongest, or the fastest, or the most ruthless. They survived because they adapted. Because they learned the language of danger, no matter what shape it came in. And as the fire in the cracked lantern flickered low, and the Tigress exhaled a slow, rumbling breath, he realized something had changed. He wasn't just protecting the cub anymore. He was standing with them, against everything else. And in the cold silence of the mine, where the walls held the echoes of old wars, something unspoken settled between them. Not trust. Not yet. But something close enough to make the night a little less cold. The old mining shaft went silent after the last sound of Dominion boots faded into the wind. It was the kind of silence that didn't feel peaceful but alive, like the mountain itself was holding its breath. The human sat with his back pressed against a wall of cold, jagged stone, listening to the hum of his own heartbeat in the dark. Across the chamber, the Tigress was still standing, her enormous body outlined in the dim light from his cracked lantern. Her ears flicked at every distant sound. She hadn't relaxed once since they'd entered the tunnels. She didn't trust this place, and truthfully, neither did he. But it was the only shelter they had left. The cub was curled up near the old storage crates, fast asleep, its small chest rising and falling slowly. Its tiny tail twitched with every breath, and every time it shifted in its sleep, the Tigress's head turned immediately, instinctively guarding it. She was a predator, yes, but more than that, she was a mother. He understood that kind of loyalty. It was the same thing that made humans cross battlefields for each other. The thing the Council could never crush. The sound of the wind outside changed first. It picked up, sharper, colder, carrying a distant hum. He lifted his head, frowning. The tigress felt it too. Her fur bristled, her ears turned toward the tunnel entrance, and she let out a low growl that rolled through the chamber like distant thunder. He moved to the tunnel entrance as quietly as possible, crouched low, listening. The hum grew louder. Not ships. Not patrol boots. Drones. The council was sweeping the mountains now. He swore under his breath, grabbing his rifle from the corner. He didn't have the firepower to take on an entire drone squad, but he knew these models. They were old Dominion trackers, designed to hunt down targets through thermal signatures and movement. Loud, fast, and relentless. If the drones found the tunnel, they'd call in a strike team within minutes. Hiding wouldn't be enough. They needed to move. He turned back toward the Tigress, pointing toward the back of the chamber. A secondary tunnel sloped upward into the mountain, a vent shaft that miners had once used. It was narrow, maybe too narrow for her massive frame, but it was their only chance. She didn't move at first. Her golden eyes glinted in the half-light, reading every twitch of his body like a language. She could smell the tension on him, feel the urgency. Then, with a low rumble, she nudged the cub awake with her massive head. The little one blinked groggily, letting out a small chirp before following her toward the tunnel. He grabbed what little gear he had left, stuffed it into his pack, and moved fast. The sound of the drones was no longer distant. It was crawling into the stone. Their mechanical wings made a sound like a nest of knives. He climbed into the shaft first, signaling her to follow. The tunnel walls scraped against his shoulders, forcing him to crawl on hands and knees. Behind him, the tigress moved like something too large for the space, her breath hot and steady on his back, the cub stumbling along between them. The shaft twisted upward, forcing them to move slowly, deliberately. The first drone entered the lower chamber just as they reached the first bend. Its sensors lit up the walls with harsh white light, scanning for heat. The shaft wasn't far enough to fully mask them. If they lingered, they'd be caught. He glanced over his shoulder and saw her watching him, fangs bared in silent fury. She didn't need to understand words to know the stakes. He unclipped a flare from his pack, sparked it to life, and threw it down the shaft. The red light hit the ground just as the drone's sensor turned, tricking it into locking onto the wrong target. The machine swooped down, engines whining like a dying animal, and crashed into the flare. The explosion was small, but the noise wasn't. It would bring more. He moved faster. The shaft grew tighter, his hands raw from the rough rock, but he didn't stop. When they finally reached the upper opening, he burst out into freezing air and snow, gasping as the wind hit his face like knives. They were on the far side of the ridge now, above the valley. The forest stretched below like a sea of shadows. The tigress emerged a second later, covered in dust and blood from scraping the stone, but still silent and powerful. She set the cub down, scanned the horizon with sharp eyes, and let out a sound that wasn't quite a growl, more like a low warning to the world. He crawled to the edge of the ridge and looked down. A dozen drones were sweeping the lower slopes, their searchlights carving long white scars into the night. Farther back, through the mist, he saw the black outlines of Dominion strike transports. This wasn't just a patrol anymore. This was a full hunt. The council wanted everything here erased. Him, the tigress, the cub, the story. His brain moved through plans like cards in a deck. Running wouldn't work. They'd be hunted until the end of the world. Hiding wouldn't work. They were closing the net. The only way out was through the forest. Dense, tangled, a place that didn't belong to the council. It belonged to creatures like her. He turned to the tigress, pointed toward the tree line below, then made a slicing motion across his throat toward the mountain behind them. It wasn't elegant communication, but she understood. Her ears flattened, and she let out a low growl of agreement. They began the descent in silence, moving like shadows between the rocks. He stayed low, his breathing controlled, every sense sharpened. She moved beside him like a ghost, the cub pressed close to her legs. When a drone passed overhead, she froze with such stillness it felt like even the mountain held its breath. The drone's beam swept over their position but never saw them. As they reached the tree line, the hum of engines echoed above like a constant threat. But here, Under the thick canopy, the world changed. The snow muffled their steps. The wind died. The smell of earth and old life filled the air. This was her world, not theirs. He crouched beneath an ancient tree, staring at the dark sky between the branches. The council was relentless. He knew their kind. If they failed to find him, they would burn everything to make sure no one could hide here again. But he also knew something else. Fear wasn't a weapon that worked forever. The Tigress was watching him now, not with suspicion, but with something different. Recognition. She had seen how he moved, how he fought, how he didn't run when death came for both of them. The cub pressed its tiny body against his boot, purring softly, unaware of the war building above the forest. And as he sat there in the quiet dark, snow gathering on his shoulders, he realized something that made his jaw tighten. The council didn't know what it had just stepped into. This forest didn't belong to them. It belonged to her. And now, for the first time, it belonged to him too. The hunt was no longer one-sided. It was about to become a war. The first light of morning filtered through the heavy canopy, casting streaks of gold across the forest floor, but it wasn't warmth that woke him. It was the sound. The kind of sound only made by things that shouldn't be this far into the woods. Dominion drones were still in the sky, their faint metallic hum layered beneath the rustle of alien leaves, like steel knives cutting through silk. The human sat up against the trunk of a thick, ancient tree, rifle still across his chest, every muscle stiff from the cold night. The Tigress was already awake, crouched low on a rock with her ears forward, her golden eyes glowing like twin embers. She wasn't resting anymore. She was hunting. The cub stirred at the sound of his breathing, blinking up at him sleepily before pressing itself closer to its mother. She nudged it with her nose, soft but firm, signaling for silence. Even the forest seemed to be listening. He'd spent enough years in war zones to know the feeling. The stillness before everything goes loud. The council wouldn't give up after failing to sweep the mountain. This was their pattern. First the patrols, then the drones, and then the boots. Full strike squads. They would burn the forest to ash to erase everything, including him. And if they found her, they'd take her alive, if only to display her like a trophy. He crouched near the forest floor and spread a crude map on the ground, one he'd burned into his memory long ago when this planet was nothing more than an outpost. He traced the ridges with his gloved fingers. The Dominion forces would come from the north, through the broken ridge they'd scanned the night before. If they moved east, deeper into the forest, there were caves, a network of roots and stone tunnels old enough to be forgotten by anyone but smugglers and predators. A perfect place to vanish. But she wasn't planning to run. He could see it in her. The Tigress had spent the entire night pacing the tree line, scenting the air, listening to the sounds most humans couldn't hear. This wasn't just her territory, it was her world. And now there were enemies in it. For a predator like her, that meant only one thing. She was ready to fight. He had seen that look before, in the faces of soldiers who'd run out of places to retreat to. He rose, slinging the rifle over his shoulder, and met her gaze. No words. No translator. Just a quiet understanding that wasn't supposed to exist between a human and a creature like her. "They'll come for us," he whispered anyway, knowing she didn't need the language. "But they won't leave the same way they came." The Dominion strike came faster than he expected. They didn't march, they glided in like a blade being drawn through the forest, black armor catching the faint light, their movements too clean, too quiet. These weren't raiders. These were hunters. Special forces trained to wipe out resistance cells without a trace. They moved in a staggered formation, sweeping their rifles in precise arcs. Their scanners painted the trees in thin red beams. The forest had been their enemy before, but it had never belonged to a tigress. She struck before they saw her. One soldier at the back vanished into the dark with a single sound. One sharp, wet crunch that sent the others spinning in panic. Her roar shattered the air, shaking the trees like a storm wind. He moved at the same time, sliding into the underbrush, positioning himself on the ridge where the path narrowed into a choke point. It was a language of violence both of them spoke fluently. One distracted, the other cut through the chaos. A second Dominion soldier fell when his boot snagged on a buried tripwire, one he'd set hours ago. The mine he'd scavenged from the raiders' ship went off in a spray of fire and shrapnel, echoing through the valley. The forest exploded into war. Soldiers shouted orders through their helmets. Gunfire cracked through the trees. The Tigress moved like a ghost through the smoke, a streak of muscle and fury, slamming into the front line before they could even calibrate their weapons. He dropped 2 soldiers with clean, controlled shots, every round placed where it counted. He wasn't the strongest man in the galaxy, but war had carved precision into his bones. He moved through cover like water, firing, shifting, vanishing. They'd trained to fight humans before, but they'd never trained to fight humans and her. The Dominion squad tried to regroup, but the forest betrayed them. Every snap of a branch, every rustle of leaves, every breath they made was a map to her ears. She came from their blind spots, from behind their cover, from the dark between breaths. The cub stayed hidden in the hollow of a tree, silent, unmoving. She'd taught it well. One soldier, braver or more foolish than the rest, rushed him from behind. He barely had time to turn when a blur of striped muscle slammed into the attacker from the side, knocking him into the mud with a sound that would haunt whatever part of him survived. She stood over the man, chest heaving, blood streaking her fur. Her golden eyes flicked to the human for only a second, not asking permission, not seeking praise, just to make sure he was still standing. When the last soldier fell, the forest went quiet again. Not peaceful, just waiting. The Dominion squad was gone. But they weren't the end. They were the test. The Council never sent one squad without a second wave in orbit. He knew what would come next. Fire. Bombardment. He knelt beside the soldier who was still alive, hand clamped over the wound in his side. The man's visor cracked, showing wide, terrified eyes. "How many ships?" he asked quietly. The soldier didn't answer. He didn't have to. The comlink on his wrist was already flashing, an orbital strike beacon. She padded toward him, breathing hard, blood dripping down her claws. Her cub followed, unhurt. When she reached him, she lowered her head, staring straight into his eyes. This time, he didn't just see the predator. He saw a mother who understood what was coming. They wouldn't get another chance to run. If they stayed here, the forest would burn. But if they moved before the ships reached orbit, they could make it to the deep caves, where scanners would fail. He shut off the soldier's beacon with a hard twist of the comlink. "They'll turn this place into ash," he said softly, mostly to himself. She stepped closer, close enough that he could feel the heat of her breath on his face. She didn't flinch. Neither did he. The forest was already trembling with the distant rumble of engines. The sky above was no longer blue. It was the cold black of metal. But something inside him settled. He wasn't running alone anymore. They weren't prey anymore. He looked at her, then at the cub pressed against her leg. "Let's make them regret coming here," he whispered. And as the first shadows of Dominion ships cut across the morning sun, a human soldier and a Tigress mother disappeared into the depths of the forest. Not to hide, but to prepare for war. The sky began to change before the forest did. It always happened like that. First the air grew heavy, too still, too expectant, as if the world itself knew what was coming. Then the clouds darkened, cut apart by the shadows of descending Dominion gunships. The forest canopy shuddered under the echoing roar of their engines. Leaves scattered like frightened birds. The human crouched on the edge of a rocky ledge, his boots buried in damp earth, watching the first wave of the Council's invasion burn across the horizon. He'd seen this before on other worlds, how empires crushed resistance with the weight of their fleets. But this time was different. This time, he wasn't alone. Behind him, the Tigress moved like a living storm. Her golden eyes cut through the gloom like twin suns, her striped fur streaked with mud and dried blood from the earlier battle. She wasn't just protecting her cub anymore. She was standing her ground. The cub pressed against her massive leg, its tiny chest rising and falling fast, feeling the tremors of engines above them. He crouched beside her and pressed a hand to the damp soil, listening. Hundreds of boots. Dropships. Drones. They weren't sending a squad this time. They were sending a small army. The Council's plan was clear. Destroy everything, erase every trace, silence the story before it spread. But it had already spread. A patrol squad had vanished. A Dominion strike team had been crushed. And rumors had already begun to slip through the outer colonies like wildfire. Rumors of a human and a predator who had turned a council hunting ground into a battlefield. Empires feared stories like that. Because stories outlived fear. He looked down at the cub, at the way it clung to its mother, and then back to the ridge. If they ran now, they might live another day. But this wasn't just about living. This was about what came after. If the council burned this forest, it wouldn't just kill them. It would kill the story. And humanity had never been good at walking away when it mattered most. The first dropships broke through the canopy like knives, trees snapping beneath their weight. Dozens of soldiers spilled out in perfect formation, black armor gleaming in the fractured light. Their visors swept across the trees, scanning for movement. They didn't see him. Not yet. He moved back into the undergrowth, signaling silently to the Tigress. She understood without words. They had learned to move like two parts of the same shadow. The Dominion soldiers advanced with methodical precision, pushing deeper into the forest, fanning out to surround the ridge. They thought they were hunting. They didn't realize they were walking into someone else's ground. The forest was hers. It had always been hers. He'd spent the night turning it into a labyrinth of hidden choke points, old traps from abandoned mining outposts, and tripwires rigged with the raiders' stolen charges. She had spent the night learning how to move through them like a ghost. The first trap went off when the lead formation hit the old supply trench, a mine buried beneath dead leaves. The explosion split the forest open with a roar, sending soldiers flying like broken dolls. Before they could recover, she was among them, a streak of striped fury, claws tearing through armor like fabric. Her roar shattered the air, the kind of sound that didn't just shake bones but broke courage. The Dominion soldiers turned their rifles toward her, but they never got the chance to fire twice. He struck from the flank, using the smoke and fire as cover, his rifle a whisper compared to her thunder. Each shot dropped a soldier before the others realized where he was. One by one, their formation began to fracture. They weren't trained to fight something they couldn't control, something that moved like wind and struck like teeth. But the council wasn't foolish. They adapted quickly. A second wave poured in from the west, heavier units with armored walkers designed to clear dense terrain. He cursed under his breath as the mechanical beasts crashed through the trees, their heavy guns cutting swathes through the forest. They weren't there to fight fair. They were there to wipe everything out. She didn't back down. She lunged through the chaos, weaving between the mechanical legs of the walkers, her claws raking through exposed joints, toppling the first like it was nothing more than a fragile toy. He sprinted alongside her, tossing a stolen charge beneath the second walker's belly. The explosion lit up the forest like dawn, shaking the ridge. Fire rolled through the undergrowth, and the Dominion advance finally faltered. The cub, hidden deep in a hollowed-out trunk where he'd left it, let out a small, sharp cry. For a heartbeat, everything slowed. She turned, every muscle screaming to protect her young. He moved with her, covering the path between the burning ridge and the tree hollow as the Dominion soldiers rallied. Bullets tore through branches. He felt the heat of a round graze past his shoulder, ripping fabric and skin, but he didn't stop. She crashed into the advancing soldiers like a storm, giving him the opening he needed. He grabbed the cub, pulling it against his chest, and spun back as she leapt over him, claws flashing. For a brief moment, they moved as if they'd fought together all their lives. One human, one tigress, and a cub that carried the future neither of them fully understood yet. The last Dominion officer fell to his knees as she stood over him, snarling, her massive frame casting a shadow against the flames behind her. He didn't beg. He didn't get the chance. Her claws ended it in silence. When the last gun fell quiet, only the forest remained, scarred, burning in places, but alive. The Dominion forces had been shattered. And above, the distant roar of retreating ships echoed like a grudging admission of defeat. The council wouldn't stop. He knew that. She knew that. But this was more than just a fight. This was a message. He sank down against a fallen tree, breathing hard, blood streaking down his arm. The tigress padded toward him, the cub wriggling free of his arms and running back to her side. She lowered her head until her eyes were level with his. For the first time since they met, she wasn't just watching him. She was acknowledging him. Not as prey, not as a stranger, but as something closer to her own, a warrior who had stood beside her when the sky fell. The flames reflected in her golden eyes as she let out a low rumble. Not a growl this time, but something softer, deeper. The cub pressed against his leg as if it, too, had chosen him. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. The council would return, and the war would spread beyond this forest. But tonight, he understood something that empires had never learned. Alliances aren't always forged in treaties. Sometimes, they're born in fire, in survival, in standing shoulder to shoulder when the world tries to break you. Above them, the sky began to clear, the black silhouettes of Dominion ships vanishing beyond the clouds. The forest was quiet again, but not the kind of quiet it had been before. This silence was different. It was the silence of something that had survived. He stood slowly, slinging the rifle over his shoulder, meeting her gaze one last time before they began to move into the deeper woods together. This was no longer just his fight. It was theirs. And somewhere, in the shadows of a broken empire, a story was being born, of a human who shared his fire with a cub, and a tigress mother who answered with war. Thank you for listening to this HFY sci-fi story. If this story struck a chord, leave a like, share it with others, and tell me your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe for more powerful HFY stories where humanity doesn't bow. It stands, fights, and changes everything.